I want to start in Pittsburgh with the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, losing to the Cleveland Browns by a score of 48-37 yesterday, in a game that, if you had asked me which game this weekend would have been a blowout, this game was not high on my list in terms of games that could have been blowouts, but nonetheless, sit down at the end of the first quarter. I know I was a bad reporter. I did not sit the entire time. I did not watch the entire thing all the way through. And which kind of sucks because I sat down with my food, came home from getting some dinner. I sat down with my food, and I admittedly almost spit out my food when I saw the score of that game. So I guess bad on me for going out and getting something to eat and missing the entire, nearly the entire plethora of Browns scoring in the first quarter. But yeah, that game was probably one of the more pathetic displays of football I've seen out of a team that's supposed to be as good as the Pittsburgh Steelers were supposed to be. The Pittsburgh Steelers have an ego problem. No, let me rephrase that. The Pittsburgh Steelers have an image problem. And it's something that has developed over the last couple of seasons. And it's something that is fixable. And in fact, I think that the loss to the Cleveland Browns is exactly the thing that is going to fix that. But obviously, the Steelers starting the season 11-0, finished the season 12-4, so going only 1-4 in your last 5 games. The difference between the team that started 11-0 and the team that finished the season 1-4 is extremely different. Most teams, I guess the perception when you're going on an undefeated streak and you lose that first game, it's like, oh, the pressure's finally off. I don't have to be perfect anymore. And that just wasn't the way with the Steelers. I feel like they added more pressure onto themselves. I feel like, again, the image and the ego problem is that they expected to be perfect with how they were playing. So when that first loss came, it was kind of just a shock to the neurons. Like, wow, we lost. This can't be true. And instead of coming back down to earth, they not only came back to earth, they hit down into the Earth's core like an asteroid. And it just wasn't pretty. I mean, you could kind of feel like this was coming with how the Pittsburgh Steelers played the last couple weeks of the season heading into the playoffs. But I don't think anybody would have predicted this. And it's because of an image problem. When you think about the Pittsburgh Steelers, and obviously this will apply to multiple generations, and multiple generations will have different answers. But when you think about the Pittsburgh Steelers, specifically the player personnel, who do you think of? When I was growing up, it was Hines Ward, Jerome Bettis, Ryan Shazier, James Harrison, Troy Polamalu, that's another big name. Guys that are really not necessarily quiet, but calm in demeanor. And they were a hard-hitting football team. So hard-hitting. And of course, if you go back to the Steel Curtains in the 70s, I'm sure you can pick out a couple of names that are just as meaningful, especially in the history of that franchise. But you look at those names and then compare that to what you see today. Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, James Conner, Ben Roethlisberger. And you notice, especially in the team's demeanor, it's vastly different. It doesn't feel like the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is why I say that the team has an image problem. Instead of shutting up, getting on the line, running you off the ball, and smacking you in the mouth, we're dancing on logos with TikTok. We're talking smack before the game. Of course, Juju Smith-Schuster saying, the Browns are just the Browns. They're nothing but gray faces to me. And I'm sure that he is probably got a very fine image now in his head of who the Browns were, considering that the Browns spanked the Steelers so hard. But you take a look at the difference between what you think the Steelers to be as a personality and what we saw on the football field this year, and it's so clear that the image problem just comes from the philosophy of the team. And that philosophy is something that is going to need to be fixed in the offseason, and it's something that should be fixed with this loss. There is a fine line with team chemistry and not only team chemistry, but with team personality. I think every team has a personality. It's important for a good football team to have a good personality. It's somewhere on the scale between having too much swagger to where it makes you unprepared for games and you get yourself a bit of an ego and it affects your play on the football field, and having just a cold personality and having nothing affect you and just playing uninspired football all the time. And I think that the Pittsburgh Steelers tilted way too much on the scale of going for far too much swagger to the point that they were unprepared. Because they looked woefully unprepared on Sunday. And, this is the culture is something that the Steelers in the past, especially in the past 4 or 5 years, it's something that they have controlled well. Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, I think Mike Tomlin handled that situation with those players about as well as he could have. So it's almost really surprising to me that I'm explaining and sharing with you all my opinion that the Steelers have this image problem, because they haven't. It's almost something that kind of popped up out of nowhere. And I guess with the refreshing of players, it's something that Mike Tomlin hasn't really had time to deal with and experience with these new players and this team, especially because of the preseason being taken away via COVID. But there's no excuse for how they played other than they just weren't prepared. The Cleveland Browns coming in without their head coach, having not practiced pretty much the entire week, and dropping 28 points on the supposedly one of the better teams in the NFL in the first quarter, the first 15 minutes. That speaks to unpreparedness. That speaks to an ego problem. It speaks to an image problem. And I'm speaking specifically of the offense. Now, the defense didn't play fantastic either. The number one pass rush defense in the NFL couldn't do anything to Baker Mayfield. And I mean absolutely nothing. I think maybe there was 1 or 2 sacks in the game. Actually, take a quick look. We'll come back to that. We'll see if we can get a stat for you there. But it was specifically, this image problem is specifically on the offense. And, Big Ben also didn't really do himself any favors yesterday in terms of his perception. Is the result of the game all on Big Ben? Because Big Ben had an impressive game, but also a very bad game. I mean, as I read the stat line earlier, 47 for 68, 501 yards, 4 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. QBR rating is 66.8. Overall rating of 85.8. You should never have your 38-year-old quarterback throwing nearly 70 times a game. I'm sure that Big Ben is waking up painfully sore this morning. But, Roethlisberger throwing for 500 yards of offense is impressive, but completely unnecessary. And so that kind of makes the point extremely mute when you look at that in the context of the game. Your quarterback should not have to throw for 500 yards to even remain even slightly competitive in the ball game. But the 4 turnovers, some of them were his fault. I'd say probably 2 out of the 4 were his fault. The one bad one was the one that came late in the game to Taki, the one where he just completely missed Taki, which has probably one of the best names in the NFL. That's just so much fun to say, Taki. But that interception to TT really was a bad one, and I think that's the one that people will remember. Because batted balls, dropped passes, the receivers weren't necessarily helping Ben all that much throughout the game. Eric Ebron had a couple of really bad drops that could have been beneficial for the Steelers. I believe one of them happened in the end zone. But Big Ben overall, wasn't exactly accurate. He had a couple of balls batted down, and as I said too, the interceptions were mostly his fault. The other 2 were batted around, and a lot of that was due to the inaccuracy of Big Ben. That's definitely not the game that he wanted to have going out. If he does choose to retire, I think he's going to be back. He does have 1 year left on his contract. I think he'll be back. So the question itself is, with this image issue, do the Steelers completely tear up the offense? And my answer, again, is no. This loss is something that I think is exactly what the Pittsburgh Steelers needed to become the Pittsburgh Steelers again. The fact that they lost in a blowout fashion, and I know if you take a look at the score, you're going to say, well, they only lost by 11 points. That's not really much of a blowout. But you could, as I said, you could tell that the Browns were kind of just letting their foot off the gas. They had such an insurmountable lead within the first 15 minutes of the game that they really didn't necessarily have to play the toughest defense. And, of course, Baker Mayfield played incredible on offense. He had probably one of his best games as a professional. Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt both also had great games on the ground. So there really wasn't much that the Browns had to do. They'll probably go to Kansas City next week feeling a little bit more rested than they would have been if it was a closer, more hard-hitting game. But the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're going to have to fix their image problem during the offseason. Otherwise, the last couple of years of Big Ben and his era in Pittsburgh is going to come to a disappointing close. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching that segment of the Hard Headed Sports Podcast. If you're interested in watching more of these segments coming out every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday as the show does, you should click subscribe to the Hard Headed Sports YouTube channel. And if you are interested in listening to the entire Hard Headed Sports Podcast in full, links in the descriptions to the Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts available on all those platforms. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and I will see you very soon.